Hi everyone, welcome to the Virtual Muleys online meetup group. Thank you for joining us today. Today we have Susmit Day from DXC Partners, who will be joining us and telling us about his custom logging framework for using Mule 4. I'll hand over to you, Susmit. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Sushmit Day. I'm a senior MuleSoft specialist in DXC System Partners. The Mule for Java SDK, we have built a custom framework using Mule for SDK. So the purpose of this presentation is to actually understand what are the features of Mule for SDK, what are the types of SDK, and we have built a custom framework using the SDK, so we'll try to demonstrate how we can have it in action. So as I said, this is the agenda for today's presentation. We'll have an introduction, brief introduction, and then first we'll see how you can use the Mule for SDK, how you can create a project which we call Mule for SDK extension project. Then we'll describe how the Mule for SDK project looks like, what are the core components of the SDK project. And after knowing about the Mule for SDK, we'll try to implement it using a custom logging framework. So the purpose of this presentation is not to demonstrate like how logging works, but rather the focus is on Mule for SDK and know what are the features of it and how we can use it for a benefit. Then we'll actually see the demo, and at last you can ask questions in the live chat. So there is a live chat, you can always post in there if you have any questions for me. Okay, so we'll proceed. So just to start with, Mule Sdk is actually to extend what Mule provides out of the box. So you can have Mule Sdk to build functionalities on the top of what MuleSoft provides. And there is an API provided by MuleSoft, so you can use that to create Mule Sdk projects, and there you can have your custom implementations of different features that you want to implement. And you can use it in your Mule application. So you can build custom connectors and import those connectors. We'll see how all those works, and use those as use Mule SDK to build your custom connector and use it in your Mule application. So Mule SDK, there are two variants of Mule SDK basically. One is called the XML Sdk, and the second one is Java Sdk. So Sdk stands for Software Development Kit. It's similar to Java Sdk and sorry, JDK. So XML Sdk provides XML-based syntax. So we can implement a lot of custom logic using XML-based syntax. So if you compare Java SDK with XML Sdk, XML provides simpler configurations, but it has some limitations. So Java SDK is much more powerful. So people who are aware of DevKit, which existed in Mule 3, it is similar to that, but SDK is much more powerful. So I haven't done a comparison between DevKit and how it evolved as an SDK in Mule 4, but we'll try to only talk about the Mule SDK available in Mule 4. And the second variant is Java SDK. It provides some advanced features like non-blocking operations, the connectors that you use in your Mule flow from Mule 4. Those provides non-blocking operations with callbacks. And you can also implement sources and routers and transactions as well. So which means if you have built a custom connector and if you have a transaction context like global transaction in your Mule application, and you use that connector in your Mule application, it can participate in the global transaction. So Mule for SDK SDK is evolving. So Mule is releasing different versions of SDK. So if you are using Mule 4.1, so it should support all SDK versions that are less than equals to 1.1. So that's why you see 4.x supports any SDK that is less than equals to 1.x dot the minor version. And Mule SDK docs, MuleSoft has like description of all the features that are available in SDK. So you can find the documentation in SDK/1.1. And for today's agenda, we are going to discuss about only the Java SDK. So we'll not cover the XML SDK. So you can check the documentation if you want XML. It's simpler, as I said, to do. But Java SDK is more interesting, probably. So for developers, what I have observed personally is that maybe very few developers are actually using SDK. They are building a lot of Mule applications using Mule features, but to use this feature, probably it needs more exposure. So the purpose of this today's meetup and this presentation is actually to encourage developers to use Mule SDK. So the first thing is to set up an SDK project. So Mule provides archetypes. So if you are familiar with Maven, archetypes are template projects. So you don't need to build your SDK project by yourself. There is a template available, and there is a mechanism using which you can create a Mule SDK project. And that mechanism is via a repository, archetype repository catalog. So there are two ways you can create a Mule SDK project. Either you use a Maven command like this. It uses a Mule provided plugin to generate an SDK extension project, or you can configure. The simplest way is to actually use this link. I'll share the presentation. It's with the interested parties, and then you can pick up these links from here as well. It provides an archetype catalog link, which you can configure in your Anypoint Studio, and using that, you can actually create a Mule SDK extension project. It's that simple. And how you do that? So I'll shift the focus to my Anypoint Studio to see how that works. So this is my Anypoint Studio. Please ignore these codes for now. So if I go to Preferences and Maven, so to use Maven in your Anypoint Studio, you need to install the Maven plugin in Eclipse, M2E as we call it, and you go to Archetypes, and then you add a remote archetype catalog. So I have added the MuleSoft archetype catalog here. It makes it easier to create an SDK extension project using an archetype catalog. So how you do that? Basically, you create a new project, and you select Maven project, you click next, and in the archetype catalog, it should show you all the templates that MuleSoft provides. So for example, for our purpose, we want to use the extension module, so which is this one. So it gives you a sample for XML archetype and also the Java archetype. The latest version is 1.2.0, as I've selected the latest version to display as only. You can select this, click next, and then provide all the information about your project name and the group ID and all, and then it will artifact ID, so it will generate a Maven project which will have all the like sample template Java codes ready for you to be used. This is how you create an SDK extension project. This is the first step, because we start creating SDK projects, and then we have to know the SDK structure. So what are the components available in Mule for Java SDK? So you need to have experience on Java to actually build the codes in using Java SDK. So basically, the components are a module, configuration, connection providers, parameters, and components. And within components, there are different types of components that are provided. So you can build different types of components. So module is actually a grouping of different components. So just like you must have used an HTTP connector. So if you HTTP is probably the module, and within HTTP module you have an HTTP listener, you have an HTTP requester. So the module is actually the group. So from Mule 4, what happens is that the connectors are grouped under modules. Okay. So we'll see details of what these components are and what are they used for. So module, as I said, is used for grouping. Configuration is for keeping shared information, which is shared across the component. So if you see a component uses a configuration, so it controls different components that you implement. Connection providers, if you're using connection to resources, which can be database, file system, or an MQ, then you implement that using the connection providers. And parameters are like input or arguments that you pass as input to your connector, and that are received by the SDK code for processing. So those are implemented using parameters. And components are different types of operations or sources, routers, scopes, and functions. So these are features. So for our example today, we'll only use operations. So as I said, if you are considering an HTTP module, the different operations there, one is a listener, which implements a source, like you're receiving an input as an input, a message, and you're processing it. But when you're using operations, it's just invoking a particular operation, and you have a logic that gets implemented and executed within your operation. So we'll go details into see the details of each component. So we have parameters, configurations, connections, and components. These are four main components of Mule Sdk. Parameter, as I said, are arguments. You can group parameters using parameter group. For our example, we have used this, and there are parameters which can be like a drop down. So you can select from a list of values. Configurations, as I said, it controls the operations or components that you implement. So you must have used configurations before in your connector, HTTP connector. If you have used that, you have created an HTTP config. And connections are actually implementation of connectivity to different resources. So if your connector has to interact with databases, files, as I said, you need to implement that. And components, these are the 5 components that you can implement: operations, sources, routers, functions, and scopes. For our example today, we are going to implement an operation, basically. So we're going to see Mule Sdk in action today. And for that, we have chosen to implement this framework. So what this framework does, it's an example of logging in an on-premise scenario, basically. So if you have a Mule application which is deployed in an on-premise runtime, using this connector, a custom connector that we have built, you can actually generate logs in JSON format, and which will capture all your Mule's context information, like your payload and errors, and if you are handling an input stream, it will capture your attributes and all this information, contextual information. By simple logging, you can just log a string, but you won't capture all the contextual information, and you cannot actually ship those or export those into an external log analytics tool. So in our example, we are going to use ELK as an external log analytics tool, and we are going to use the custom connector that we're going to build using Mule Sdk using log4j2 to generate JSON logs. So as you can see in the diagram, it generates JSON logs into the file system, and we have configured ELK to actually pick up these logs and ship it to Elasticsearch and display using Kibana dashboards. So that's the demo today using the SDK that I plan to present. And this is, as I said, this is not an example or demonstration of how you should do logging. For example, you might be asking question like why you'd use Logstash to directly poll, because it's not that scalable. You'd probably prefer an agent to publish logs into Logstash. So your logging implementation can be different. It's just to demonstrate how the custom logging connector will work. And to visualize the logs, we had to use a log analytics tool. So we have picked up ELK to use it for our demo. So, okay, so this is just a description of the extension project, because we have talked about all these components. I don't know if it's feasible enough. Okay, so if you see, it actually, when you create an SDK project using the archetype, you pick up the template and you generate a project, it generates all these Java classes by its own. So you don't need to create these Java classes. Basically, it generates. So it creates a configuration connection. You have an extension, which is the module, operations, and you have a connection provider, which is an implementation of a connection to a particular resource. In our example, since we're handling files, so you can think of connections to file systems using log4j2 logger objects, right? So that's how we're going to implement it. And we'll see that. It also generates a file for implementing your automated test cases. That also is provided as a part of SDK feature. You can implement some test cases which you want to run while you build your package, build your project, sorry. So this is the structure of the Mule SDK project. And the package hierarchy is actually given, passed as an input to the archetype. So you actually mention like the hierarchy of the package that you want to use. So for us, it's like com.dxe.sp.mule, for example, and it generates all the files within that. And here you see I have also created a custom log parameters just to have all the attributes of the log that you want to capture as a POJO. And there also we have implemented a parameter group. So we'll see how the parameter group works. It actually groups all the parameters together. And when you use the connector, it will show all of those parameters in a particular panel. Okay, so we'll move on. I'll not go into details of each of these Java class. We'll see those in Anypoint Studio anyway. So this is the starting point, as I said, module which groups together all the components. And in there, you need to, because we are, Mule configurations are XML based configurations. So those will have an XML like a namespace, and then you have the extension name. So what is displayed in the connector panel from where you drag and drop your connector. So this is the name which is going to be displayed there, and this is the prefix of the connector in the XML. Okay, so we can also see the structure in Anypoint Studio. So this is an example for example, this one. This is our code, and all these files, class files, actually represent each of those SDK components that we have just discussed, right? And also for a custom connector, you probably want to use your own like a connector image so that it displays in the Mule palette, right? So for that, you need to create, I haven't explicitly mentioned it in the presentation slide, but you need to create an icon folder in your project base folder, root folder, and then you need to put a file, an SVG image file there, which should be named icon.svg, and the size of the file should be 58 or below 58 into 58. Otherwise, it won't display. So I'll show you how that works. And let's see the extension project's form for a moment. So here you can see I've given a version of this project. I've given an artifact ID. The packaging should always be Mule extension, and you need to give a name to your project. And there are certain dependencies, so you can add dependencies according to your need. And there are certain other components here. There is a parent POM where all the dependencies and plugins exist, which are provided by MuleSoft for implementing in the SDK project. And you'd notice that the group ID doesn't look like a normal group ID. I'll come to that, why it is a GUID mentioned in the group ID. And for distribution management, you see I have actually added the Anypoint Exchange link with the organization where I want to actually maintain this connector. So I'll come to this when we see like how you actually upload your connector in the Exchange. Basically, your connector the developer so that everyone can use it. You not only need to build it or install it in your local repository, you need to have it either in the Exchange or an Artifactory, which is where you maintain all your distributions, right? So you can have, for example, in our example, we are using Exchange as a repository for sharing the custom connector, but you can also use Artifactory where you can deploy this connector and people can use that across your organization. So this is how SDK project looks like. We'll go into the core components of it. Now, as I said, the extension project looks like this. It has the extension name, etc. And the operations look like this. So what basically happens for an operation is that any public method that you put in the operations class becomes an operation. So when you use the connector, you have a module at the top level. any method, public method, unless you suppress it and say that you don't want it to be exposed as an operation. So you give a display name as well. So if my extension was called a custom logger, the operation, so one of the operation or component that the custom logger contains is a custom file logger. So you can have because it's an on-premise scenario, we're doing a custom file logger. You can have a Cloud Hub version of it. You can call it like a custom Cloud Hub logger, something like that. So if you have a Cloud Hub version of it, variant of it. So this is how it's implemented. And I'll not go through the code. This is in GitHub, so I'll share the link where you can download and see the code, how it's implemented. It's a public repository that I've created. After this presentation, Roston will probably update that in the event link. And the configurations, let's come to that. So in these configurations, if you see, some of the parameters that we have mentioned are actually common for all the operations. So here you want to capture all, your application name, your application version, environment, and default value is something that is configured here. So you can use these annotations to actually mention what default values you want to have. And these configuration or configurable parameters can be implemented in your application, and it will pick up from there. So you don't need to explicitly mention this parameter when you implement it. So when you see the connector in action, or then you'll know how these are reflected when you actually drag and drop your connector and use it. And then in the operation, if you see, we have actually fetched all these parameters which we want to actually publish into our log, the custom log that we are generating. So some of these parameters are fetched from configuration, and some of these have been fetched from the parameter group. And the operation takes as input a configuration, a connection, and a parameter group, basically. I'll come to the completion callback, what it is. It is related to the non-blocking operation. So as you know, Mule4 provides a feature of implementing non-blocking operations. So when you actually call the connector, it executes in its own, there's a thread pool from which a thread gets assigned to the connector, it executes, and then it, gives the control back to the main flow. So it executes asynchronously. So this is the feature which you can use. It gives the context of the caller, and using that, you can make a callback back to the main flow, which actually invokes your connector. So you can see the code. When you download and see the code, you'll know. And this callback actually can give a success response or an error with the error object. So this is how it's implemented. And these are all the attributes that we are logging. And we are using the connection. So you can see the connection here to actually get the connection object, which is a logger reference to a file system, and use that to actually log the information. So you see logger.log, and then you log it with a particular log level. So because it's log4j2 implementation, so you need to mention the log level, and then you want to actually log the POJO, which you fetch from this. So you generate an object message, basically, which is an object message specific to log4, actually log it. So what I'll do is that I'll show how the connector looks like before actually I deploy the connector. So if you see, the custom connector looks like this. And we talked about module and operations. So if you see here, this is the module. If you remember, we have given the name custom logger. And when you see the module in the Mule palette, it shows custom logger. And this is one of the operations. So if you remember, in the operation, we have given the name custom file logger. So you can have multiple operations or components implemented here. So custom file logger, and you can just drag and drop here at any place. Sorry about that. And let's see how this connector looks like. So if you see here, there is a connector configuration. So we spoke about configuration, how the configuration is displayed. So if you see, we have linked a configuration to our module. So when you implement the connector, it will ask for a configuration. So each module should have a configuration associated with it. That's the SDK requirement. And if you see the configuration, this is how it looks like. So if you remember, we had 3 parameters in our configuration: the application name, version, environment. This is how it displayed, and we had given default values for each of these parameters. So you don't need, the developer doesn't need to, whoever is using doesn't need to actually mention it every time he uses the configuration. It will be defaulted unless you want to customize and use something else. And for connections, if you see it, it provides an ability to create a connection pool. So if you do this, you'll see it provides a feature to actually implement your connection pool. So this is a pool of connections for your connection object that you have implemented, and that actually just provides you the log4j to logger object reference. That's the only thing that you implemented in this example. So this is the configuration. So this controls the custom file logging operation, and then, sorry, and then if you see, we have implemented a parameter group. So it parameter group shows, groups together all the parameter in a panel. So it's this area, and you give a name to the parameter group, it gets displayed here. So our parameter group is called log details. It has all these parameters, and all these values are defaulted. So for example, if I drag and drop another one here, so you see all these values are defaulted except for one field which we have left for custom login. So you can change it also, and if you have observed, all these fields support expressions. So there are different kinds of parameters. Here we are just using string parameters. You can use a content parameter as well, where you want to capture all the input stream or your payload, which can have like data in any format, XML or JSON. But here we are just serializing the information that we want to log. So if it's a payload, we are serializing the information. It can be XML, JSON. It will get serialized as a string. And you can provide custom like information as well in this message field. And there is also a feature here where you can pick up one of the information from the drop down. So this is implemented as a value provider. If you see the code, download it and see it. SDK provides a feature to implement this list of values as well, and you can have it as a parameter. So okay, we'll delete this, and we'll now see like this in this test project what we have implemented. Actually, we have used this custom connector, and how do you import this custom connector in your project? So this is already implemented. You can see it's available in the Mule palette. But if you have created a new project, you won't see this in the Mule palette because you have to import it. So how do you import it? You see, you have to go to the POM of your Mule application. Go to the POM., and there you see you have to give the group ID. You have to change it to that org ID that you saw. That's the GUID that you saw in the custom connector project. And you can give the artifact name and the version of the connector that you want to use. The classifier should always be Mule plugin. And this is when you add this dependency in your project, and then you go back to any of the Mule config, you will see automatically Mule will import your module here. And one thing you must have noticed, this connector has an image associated with this. So this is the same image which I showed you in the icon folder. It has to be named icon.svg, and you have to check the pixel, because if you attach like a big picture there as an svg file, it won't display. I've tried that with a bigger image, it didn't work. I had to reduce that, resize it. There are online tools you can use to resize your svg, and if it's below 18 to 58, it should show in your Anypoint Studio. So I've used my company's logo, for example. And for this example, what we have done, we have actually implemented a test listener, and it just listens. It's an HTTP listener, and it receives a JSON message. We have checked if the message has an element called num and it is odd or even. So if it's even, we generate an error, right? You generate a custom exception, and it goes to the here, this error on error block, and then there is a custom file logger which actually logs all the information about the error along with the context information. And if you see the default, which is for an odd number, it just records all the contextual information, but the message is success log for the odd number. And here it gives you the error log for even number. So what we'll do, we'll just run this project and see how it works. So before that, we'll go back to our presentation. I'll come to this, how you deploy your SDK module, but it's better we see how it works. So this is what we discussed. You need to add the dependency to see like the Mule SDK, connector that you have built, the custom connector. It will show up in the Mule palette, and you can drag and drop and see all the, and use it. For our example, we have used log4j2, so we haven't altered what log4j2 default log4j2 file, which is generated for every Mule project that you create. But what we have done, basically, we have added a custom JNDI here, log4j2 JNDI, which is called file_json_appender. And why we have done this is just for an example. We have created this appender so that, an async logger, which refers to a JSON file appender. And why we have used this? So that our connector uses this without interfering with any of the existing configurations that are provided as a part of the log4j2 file. So it used a custom JNDI. It refers to a JSON file appender. And the JSON file, what it does is that it uses object message as a JSON, object message as JSON object. So this, if you enable this flag, what happens is that if you are using an object message in log4j2, when you actually use the Java code to log an object message, what it does, it translates it, and the POJO gets transformed into a JSON message. I'll show you how it shows up in the log. But for every log4j2 log, it will have some metadata like the thread name, timestamp, everything. And there is a one field message where your log information gets reflected there. So let's run it. Is it running already? No. Okay, so it's running already. And if you notice one thing, apart from the HTTP module sockets, it also shows your custom logger. So this plugin has also been imported and it is launched. So what it does, basically, it checks for the number. So you can pass an even number and an odd number, and then you see what happens. So I'll try to do the same. Let's do this. So if I pass an even number, an error gets raised. And if I pass an odd number, it succeeds. So it should ideally now log both errors and success messages. So let's see. There is some logs that we have provided like in the runtime for the operation. So it shows up in the Mule runtime as well. And if you see, these logs also get published into a custom log. So test project custom log. And if you see, these messages are reflecting in the message element of the JSON. So this is just an example. So our custom connector has actually been invoked, and it has been able to generate these logs in JSON format. And as I said, we have actually installed ELK, and these logs should get published to Kibana. So let's see what is going on there. So this is a Kibana dashboard, and if you refresh it, if you see, these two logs got published consecutively. One is a success log, another is an error log. So let's expand it and see what the connector has done. It has actually serialized all the attributes and payloads. It has picked up some of this information from the configuration which you have configured in the project, and it uses this logger name, which is the custom log4j2 JMDI we have implemented. And for an exception, it actually publishes the error, the serialized error object. So there you can see it's a custom Mule application, and this is the message that we have configured. So it's an error log for an even number, and this is the log level, which is also showing in Kibana. And the success log will also capture all the contextual information, but if you see, for the exception, there is no information here because the error object has been null. So we have ignored the error object here, right? And also I've created a dashboard, or sorry, a visualization which shows like how many errors and how many total transactions have happened and how many errors have happened. So this is happening in real time using the connector. So I have hit like 2 transactions, out of this 1 has failed. So I can consecutively hit many transactions here. Sorry. And if you see, our connector is working, it is generating those logs, and it is getting published into Kibana. So I can refresh and see the stats. So if you see, my error count has increased, and the total number of transactions that I've hit has also increased. So this is happening in real time. And this is just an example of how we implemented a custom logging framework using the SDK. And you can see the logs are getting published in real time, and we can visualize them as well. This is just an example of what we can do using Mule 4 SDK. It's very powerful. It has many features. We have just implemented one component, which is operations, but there are other components as well. You can implement a source. So you see, this is an operation because we are putting it at some point in our flow. But if you want to implement a source where you actually expect an input from a source, you can also implement a source component. So that in that component, it will allow you to drag and drop into the source section, just like an HTTP listener, for example. So you can do that as well. I haven't touched based on that, but this is just a simple operation implementation of an operation. It uses log4j to publish JSON logs. That's what it does. Now we'll go back to the custom logger SDK extension project, and we'll see how you actually maintain the distribution. Because if you are building an SDK code, and you have to make sure that you share it with your developers. Developers for the connector, for example, you have built a custom connector. They should be able to look up for the connector either in an Artifactory or in Mule Anypoint Exchange. So how you do that? Anypoint Exchange actually is specific for your organization. Okay, so I'll show how Anypoint Exchange looks like. So this is my organization's Anypoint Exchange, and it is, if you see in the drop down, the organization is my organization, and my organization. So every organization has an org ID, and Mule recommends you to use Exchange to share your connectors. So upload your connector SDK custom connector that you have built into Anypoint Exchange and share it using the Exchange. You can alternatively use your Artifactory, which can be JFrog, Nexus, whatever it is. So you can use that as well, and mention that in this distribution management as a repository. And to connect to the repository exchange, you need username passwords. You might be wondering where it is. If you have used distribution management, you can configure the username password in the Maven settings file. Okay, and that will look so this ID will be the reference to the security credentials that will configure in a Maven security settings file, and then it will resolve the security and credentials. And if you see, this is the org ID. So every organization in any point platform has an org ID. So this is the org ID that you need to mention. This is the URL pattern you need to follow. So if you download the code from GitHub, you will have the access to these forms, and you can customize it according to your need. But you have to mention the org ID here. And another thing which we have seen in the beginning is that I was using the group ID as an org ID. So this is something which is required if you are publishing your asset connector as an asset into any point exchange. So Mule suggests if you change the group ID to something of a name of your choice, it doesn't work. It has to be, the group ID has to be the same as the org ID of your Anypoint Platforms organization. So this is how you configure if you want to upload this artifact into Exchange. And I'll also show you like where we have mentioned the credentials for Anypoint Exchange. So you have to go to the Maven home, and there will be security settings there. Sorry, this is the master one, and this is the settings file. So in the Maven settings, you have to mention your Anypoint Platforms username password. So if you see, this has the same ID for the server that we have mentioned. So this exchange report DXC is same as exchange report DXC here. So it has a reference to that. And this here, you need to configure your Anypoint Platforms username, and you can encrypt the password here. I've encrypted it here, for example. And how you encrypt it, if you're familiar with Maven, you know. And using these credentials, what it will do, it will publish your asset into Anypoint Exchange. And how we are able to resolve the connector in our Mule application, you might be wondering, because we are using the local, I have actually done this. I have actually deployed this into my local Maven repository. So it's resolving from local repository, but you can also deploy in an Artifactory, or you can download it from Exchange into your Mule palette and use it. So let's try to run this. So what I've done, I have created basically I've created this run configuration. I've put two goals, clean and deploy. So deploy is the goal before which all the installation and packaging happens. And finally, in the deploy step, since I mentioned Exchange as a distribution management, so what it will do, it will try to deploy this custom connector into Exchange. So when you create a custom connector, you should deploy it into an Exchange, right? So let's run this and see what happens. So notice the goals which are getting executed. For the compiler plugin, then you have resource plugin. So install step actually installs it in your local repository. That's why I was able to resolve the connector locally. But if you see, the final step deploy has actually detected that I have mentioned Exchange as a distribution management platform, and it has actually started uploading, and it has uploaded the artifact into the Exchange. This step. So let's see if my connector got uploaded. So this is my platform. You see the connector doesn't exist. I'll try to refresh it. Look, it just got published here. And it also gets published with the logo. So if you have mentioned, if you have put the logo there, the image, it will also reflect here. And if you click that, I just published it. So it is showing this version and the runtime version for which it is applicable, and the time when I got published it, and the organization for which this asset got published for. Right, so it gets published. So this is how you actually publish it to the exchange, and the developers can use this connector by looking it up from the exchange. Alternatively, you can also deploy in an Artifactory. As I said, you can use JFrog or Nexus, or according to your wish. And when you do the deploy, it actually will deploy into your Artifactory. And your developers can actually use Artifactory as a repository for resolving the dependencies. And when you actually import the dependency in your Mule application, it will resolve, instead of resolving from a local Maven repository, if you don't have it there, it will resolve it from the Artifactory and probably download it into your local repository for usage. So that's all we wanted to cover in this presentation. We are just on time. We have covered like 50 minutes. We have already had in the presentation. So if you have any questions on this presentation and Mule SDK, please feel free to post in the live chat. I'm able to see the live chat, or at a later point, you can also add me or connect to me in LinkedIn and share your thoughts and provide your feedback and suggestions on this presentation. I hope you learned about SDK, or you have explored something that you haven't done before. So hope this presentation has helped you. That's all we had for today. Thank you. And the links to the presentation and the GitHub public repo will be shared in the event link. So please look out for those as well. Thank you.